Well, I was really inspired earlier today by Gifford and Kool-Aid when they were bringing up the concept of stopping the leaks in the boat.
Mhm.
Stopping the leaks in the boat. Can you give us a quick analogy of Bitcoin's leaks in their boat, Ethereum's leaks in their boat, and then
Sure.
bring us all the way to PulseChain and Pulsar with that analogy?
Yeah. Let's break down some systems. So, Bitcoin inherently of itself is proof of power, right? First, it was decentralized power, and you could do it inherently of yourself as a unit of one. Because that backup on how the system can lean or load eventually fills up, that you need more people to lift that jar or that weight up. Because technically the mathematical calculation is getting more complex. It's harder to crack. Well, that's more of a load that you need power to get through. Well, then you add pools, right? So those pools are necessary to basically mine your Bitcoin or to disperse the amount of power necessary to calculate the steam in the engine that you need to push. Well, then we had Ethereum, which is still proof of work at that point, but it's proof of programming. And so with proof of programming, we're taking this proof of work metric, but we're adding the EVM complex of how all the complexities can be called, how to turn it into a virtual machine. But when you need more juice out of the virtual machine, guess what? It costs more what? Power. Or let's revolve it now to gas, because we've moved from strictly a steam engine machine where you're building up pressure to move a revolution of a flywheel to now needing the calculation itself to be done because it's proof of programming. That's where we got hit on a T-share. So let's take that next slice because all of us are hexagons. So we have a T-share, which is proof of time. And so at proof of time, now we're using the EVM side, which is still proof of programming, but it still needs proof of power, or now proof of stake, which is resolution of power, nodes of power, sockets, if you will. Technically, now like mining farms in Bitcoin. So we can see the correlation between those two ideals, but one does one thing, one can do many, but costs more juice. So T-share, proof of time. So now we've learned carrot and stick, tongue-in-cheek mechanics of what proof of time does for you. And if Hex never got pulled from Ethereum, let's just say never launched Pulse, I call Zen proof of gas because of the intrinsic cost of gas to mint and unmint. But if Pulse or Hex never moved from Ethereum, the gas cost to unstake your Hex would have been proof of gas because of the fact that if you didn't have the financial, let's call it wherewithal, to be able to unstake that, you would have bled. And where would that bled? Gone back to the staker class. So that does give a caste-based system again on who can access a particular throughput. So we have Zen. Basically, it's an interesting thought experiment. But what it did is created fair launch crypto as a narrative and a saber rattling call again. I mean, of course, we all love the OA. OA is fantastic. Why? Because it puts power into an entity that we actually trust. But if they're not from our cut of cloth, they don't have that kind of, let's call it native security with that type of method. They automatically assume the corruption that we were talking about before. So we have proof of gas as a concept, but then creating fair launch. Now we move to PulseChain. What PulseChain is interesting because they're sister EVMs post proof of stake, which means that any upgrade in tangent can run in parallel with each other. That's very, very, very good. That's why, maybe one day some proof of mining, ETH POW, ETH Fair, and the rest of that stuff could come back to do something like ETH Classic. But since the EVM machine, that it is moving in tandem, like two different train lines moving together, we now can have cross upgrades. Difference is that a lot of people on Ethereum don't really care for either Richard Hart or they've been usurped by the narrative inherently of itself, but they still work in tandem sisters. Okay, so PulseChain. Now, Pulsar is interesting because Titan X, we can kind of get into the weeds on that if anybody want to, but it's actually a very interesting set of mechanics that creates proof of ETH. And that's why when Gifford and I were looking at this, we were like, well, we can actually build on a lot of these components that there weren't necessarily in hex, but it's a very, very, very different dessert. Sometimes you want cake, sometimes you want pie. So both are technically desserts on how you have to understand what the system actually does instead of pointing fingers, us versus them, mob mentality. No, silly. But also a lot of them haven't been architects, system designers, or really put thought into, for example, hex, e-hex, p-hex. I could care less, but tell you what, if you're holding liquid hex, you're not on the T-share train. If you're not on the T-share train, you get none of the benefits of the yield. You get none of the benefits of, let's just say, a icosahedron. You get none of the benefits of communist. You got none of the benefits of anything else that came if you were on the T-share train. So that inherently has a cost on one side or the other. PulseChain allows us to do those things cheaper, but it's not cheaper because it's theoretically better. It got scaled by a ratio of zeros that makes it cheaper. So if you have the network effect that it gets more expensive, guess what? It's going to be expensive. Good for us because we're wealthy. Yay. But you know what? You didn't solve it. You made it usable. And so what we're doing at Pulsar is very interesting as multiple different irons in the forge. But one of the bigger pillars is creation, not inflation. So we do have zero inflation. Go through the mechanics on how that works, but that is a huge thing because people want their tasty little yield. Well, you're creating inflation. People want their tasty little airdrops. You're creating inflation. The OA absorbed a lot of that inflation because on the books, numbers were vastly different than what's actually available in liquid. So that's another note that you need to understand. But another thing with Pulsar is no leaky boat. And with no leaky boat, we take a lot of pride in looking at how externalities could detract from the system, whether that's hops and swaps, whether that's inflation later on down the road. And then the third real big pillar is Perma-Bull tokenomics. And just like I was saying, proof of power, proof of time, proof of programming, proof of gas, proof of ETH, the protocol fee is your necessary, let's call it, energy that you're bringing into the system. And for our system, 90% of that economic energy actually goes to buy and burn Pulsar off the market. So not only do we not have inflation, if you decide to create Pulsar by minting it, which is taking ETH and Titan X and take them both into a system, we do a bunch of magic we can get into. You receive your tokens immediately. We handle the bridging. We handle everything in the locked V2 liquidity pool, all sorts of that. But that economic energy that you put, 90% of that can only do one thing, and it's buy and burn Pulsar and take it off the market. So by participating in the creation aspect, you are creating a larger rocket launcher for us to completely decimate the supply. But the cool part is you really don't need it because inherently of itself, the inflation problem is where you're nipping yourself in the butt. ETH is going to go up in value, going to be harder to create inherently of itself. Titan has many mechanics that make it harder to create based on time. We all understand a T-share, right? It's the same thing, but just some of the vernacular has been ripped apart and applied in a different way. So those two metrics alone make it harder and harder to create the asset. The buy and burn is an overwatcher that can immediately create the ceiling, which is interesting. If we go back to icosahedron, what we learned from that, what we learned from, let's say, the inflation bonus that was given for the 10x multipliers, well, that dramatically changed the system. Those are caveats that you have to learn to how to digest the whole thing. But those are some of the, there's so much under the Pulsar onion that you can rip apart. But again, no leaky boat means take the time to figure out what is the best path of resistance and what is the most beneficial for the system inherently. And if it's the best for the system, it's going to be best for the user in the long run.
Yeah. To quote my kids, bruh, like, bruh, did I say light years ahead of light years ahead of light years? My brain was screaming uncle, and I was following along like, holy shit. Sorry, go. I didn't mean to jump in and cut you off, Bets. I saw you wanted to jump in there.